What's going on, guys? Sledgehammer70 back, and today I wanted to do a video on breaking in your brand new 2016 Camaro. Now, this is a hot topic among a lot of car enthusiasts, from the old school to the new school. There's a million different ways that have been outlined on how to properly break in your vehicle. Now, the one thing that I never see really talked about, because most people only talk about break-in in regards to the motor, but there's all sorts of aspects of your car that need break-in, such as the motor, you have the transmission, you have your brakes, and a few other items across the board. Now, with that being said, I want to get into the top one, the motor. Now, there's a lot of back and forth on what is needed here. Now, GM in the manual outlines for the 2016 Camaro SS, you should allow a break-in period of 1,500 miles. Like, that's insane. Like, that's a lot. That's a ton of miles. It's like, hey, here's your brand new sports car. Don't drive it like an animal for a while. Like, it takes a while to get 1,500 miles for most people who are driving these cars. Now, if you look at the LT1 motor in itself on the GM Performance site, the manual outline there only covers, basically outlines for the car 500 miles. Now, getting into the debate of why do you actually need to break in your motor and what is the difference if I do it one way versus the other. Now, there's going to be a lot of mechanical guys that I think will leave comments here, and I encourage you, please share your process, but I'm going to do my best to explain this to how I understand. So when you build a motor versus, let's go back. So building motors 20 years ago didn't provide as much tolerance in the pistons and just the craftsmanship in general. Like, higher end motors from higher end companies were the best motors you can get back in 1990, 1980s, right? Whereas today, because the craft has progressed so much and there's so much like robot-based engineering in regards to manufacturing and whatnot, they get those tolerances so close and so precise that the general batch of motors being made are just as high quality as the motors that were made 20 to 30 years ago. That were like the top of the end motors for that time. Now, the biggest thing is when all these parts come together, when they're assembled at the plant, there is specific ways that the motor functions to allow those parts and pieces to work together. So pistons going up and down, the bearings stretching out and functioning across the board. But the biggest thing that you want in breaking in your motor, there's rings around your piston. Those pistons slide up and down against the cylinder walls. And what you're trying to do is, there's usually, in most motors, there's a crosshatch pattern that as those cylinders rev up for the first time, they create their lifelong bond in that motor. Now, doing that bond improperly can cause that ring to not seat properly, or basically not expand properly, and instead of just gliding across the wall, it's rubbing against the wall and can destroy your motor in the long run, create what's called blow-by, so you're getting a lot more oil burnt off in the vehicle, shortening the life of the motor, burning a lot of oil, all sorts of bad things. So typically, your average mechanic or your average Joe will tell you, run your vehicle at between a set precision of RPM. So you don't want to run the car full throttle the entire time. You want to stay between an RPMs of like 2,000 to 4,000 for a good 20 minutes straight, and vary it. You don't want it to be like cruise control style, to allow those rings to expand properly and seat properly across the piston. Now, some guys will say you need to do this for a full 1,500 miles, just as the break-in outlines. Other guys will tell you it is the most important to do this within the first 20 minutes of this engine being alive. And then on top of that, being fairly careful within the first 50 miles. Now, what most people don't talk about is that a lot of this process is done at the factory. Now, I know some of you guys work for GM, potentially even work for the engine factories, and I'd love to get your input if you can in the comments below. But from what I understand, GM does a mass majority of the initial break-in to allow themselves to not have warranty issues down the road. Because the last thing like GM wants to do is put this $18,000 motor in your hands and expect you to do the break-in properly. GM knows that these cars are going to dealer lots and they're going to get test driven, and some asshat's going to come along and put his foot into the floor and rev it to the highest possibility. Like, they are not dumb to this. So a lot of that break-in does take place at the factory. The biggest thing is that these parts need to basically burnish the surfaces that they're living against for the long term of the motor. And by not doing a proper break-in, you know, you can potentially cause problems. So my feeling on this is I do believe GM does a bulk of this break-in before that car ever leaves. Well, one, before the motor leaves the factory, but two, before the car leaves. I still think for like the first 50 to 200 miles, you should still follow the process. You shouldn't do high-speed runs. You shouldn't be revving your vehicle to the highest RPM possible. You shouldn't be setting cruise control and letting your car run for one speed. Those are just basic things. But letting your RPM range stay between the 2,000 to 4,000 range, letting those parts burnish to their, you know, to the sidewall, obviously the piston, but that's just the motor. So the one biggest thing that other people talk about is how often should I get my oil changed? And I'm a firm believer that after about 50 miles, you should change your oil once. Your oil should have like almost like a glittery, flaky gloss to it. And what that is that is literally the crosshatch patterns from the cylinder walls and the other parts of the motor that have fallen through the oil that are at the bottom of your pan, and some will get picked up by the oil filter. It should be filtered out, but in general, it's gonna happen. Empty that out, put fresh oil in, you should be good. Usually what I'll do is after that 20, 50 mile empty, I'll then change the oil once again at 1,000 miles and then follow the GM or my dealership's oil change process. So I think it's like 3,500 miles or something like that for synthetic oil. But that's my process. Is that the right process? I like to think so, but then again, that's just me reading what mechanics with hundreds of years, but you know, mechanics that have 30, 40 years of experience and how they've broken in motors across the board. Now, I do again firmly believe GM does do most of the break-in before the motor ever even or motor or car leaves the factory, just because I don't believe that they would put that kind of pressure or work on their people buying their products, because I just think they'd have all sorts of problems with the motors in the long run, and that's never a fun thing. But should you follow the guide? Yeah. But the other thing I want to touch on is, again, that was all motor based. The other side of it is brakes. Now, a lot of people don't realize the difference between just your standard brakes and performance brakes. Now, your standard brakes, when you put them on a brand new car, the rotor on the vehicle is rough enough to where it's going to peel off that first layer of your brake pads and you'll be good to go within about 20 minutes. Now, you shouldn't do power braking. You shouldn't go as fast as you can and slam on your brakes on the first go around, but just your basic driving on pads that are not performance pads don't really need a crazy break-in. But when you do get to performance pads or racing pads, there is a process you should follow. And a lot of manufacturers will outline the exact process you need to follow to break in those pads properly. But the biggest quick way to explain it is you want to heat up the brakes at first get-go to produce fade. And once that happens, you want your brakes to cool off. And after that point, your brake pads are broken in. Now again, some people feel differently about that process, and I'm all for the different processes there. If you guys have a specific process that you use to break in your brakes, let me know in the comments below. I'm not here to tell you mine is right and yours is wrong. I'm just here to hopefully help you hopefully guide you to the proper process. Now, when it comes to transmissions on these cars, it's basically, you know, these things are closed boxes. Like, transmissions have gotten so good over the years that most dealers, they don't even require transmission fluid flushes for a long time. Most cars out there don't even have the ability to flush a transmission You have to take it to the dealer, and there's a special process where they empty it and flush it, and that's usually done like at 60,000 or 120,000 miles, whatever. But as long as you follow the motor break-in process, I believe your transmission should be fine. Same with your differential, especially for you manual guys out there. There is some clutch burn-in that you need to do, but again, as long as you're following that motor break-in process, your clutch, your differential, your transmission should all follow in suit and be in line with that. I talked on brakes a little bit, but yeah, I mean, the biggest thing, I talked about oil changes when I do my oil changes. The other thing is mainly when you have a car and GM is outlining you need 1,500 miles. I am a firm believer that is like for all aspects of the car, making sure the suspension is all in place, letting the engine cross in properly, allowing the transmission to break in, the differential, the brakes, all that stuff. The other side is like, some people will say, well, the bearings are really important. That goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where the precision of today's craftsmanship of motors is so precise that these bearings, they don't need as much break-in as they once did before to fall into line perfectly, you know, and you know, that's how I feel about it. So that's my take on break-in. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Again, I'm not here to tell you I'm right and you're wrong. I'm here to hopefully just guide you a little bit on the proper process or what you should be looking for. Again, the GM manual does outline the proper way to break in the motor. It does also outline how to break in the brakes as well. But if you follow those guides, you can't go wrong. The biggest thing you could do is baddest thing you could do is not do break-in at all, even for a short period, and you can create all sorts of blow-by and burning oil and all that kind of great, like, bad stuff. You just don't want to do that. So yeah, so that's today's video. Again, appreciate you guys sticking out. This was a long one. I appreciate all you guys who have made it this far, and if you have, you guys are awesome. I thank you guys for supporting the channel. As always, tons of subscribes, tons of people commenting and posting. I love it all. I'm going to keep content coming. And until next time, guys, I will see you on the road.